Hi everyone, my name is Cassandra Colvin and I'm on behalf of the ASCILITE Learning Analytics SIG. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar with Dr Kate Thompson. I'll get her to introduce her theme, but I'd like to just introduce her to you all. So Kate is Senior Lecturer in Educational Technology within the School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University. And the underlying focus of her research is learning sciences, specifically collaborative learning and discovering patterns of learning interaction that could be used by an instructor to indicate progress through a task. Her research in this area influences how educators design for the use of a range of digital technologies as the tool around which collaboration occurs is increasingly complex face-to-face and online collaborative environments. Kate's research has been applied in collaborative learning and learning situations that include school students, both primary and secondary, undergraduate and postgraduate students. A recent focus has been in interdisciplinary collaboration with two core groups, environmental science graduates in the USA and STEAM in Australia. The impact of this research is widespread in the USA through a National Science Foundation grant. The team is implementing the research-informed design of collaborative, interdisciplinary problem solving in 5 institutions, and another 5 will be added in 2017. In Australia, Dr Thompson leads teams working networks of schools looking at school change mediated by STEAM and digital technologies in Brisbane and Canberra. In 2016, Dr Thompson received funding to lead the Creative Practice Lab at Griffith University, located in a newly constructed learning space in the School of Education and Professional Studies. This lab combines teacher education and digital technologies with state-of-the-art video recording and online collaboration systems. The ultimate aim of the research in the lab is to understand pedagogical practices in contemporary learning spaces, learning analytics informed practice, and online collaboration and design. This is just fantastic, Kate. I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk. Just a little bit of housekeeping before you start. People, if you've got questions, can I encourage you to, if you're not already in the space, in the bottom right-hand corner of the Blackboard screen, you'll see a little balloon bubble there, and if you press on there, then you'll be in a chat window, and in there, if you put your questions, I'll kind of keep an eye on them, and if we get a flurry, I will interrupt Kate. Otherwise, we might try and save some of those questions until the end. So Kate, away you go. I'm going to mute my mic.
Thanks very much for that. That was a long introduction. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for having me to talk about some of my work today. I'm really looking forward to it. So I am going to start. Today I'm going to talk about data analytics and learning, interdisciplinary approaches to the generation of actionable knowledge. If you have questions, I'm kind of happy to be a bit fluid. So I'm used to teaching in this sort of environment. So happy to take questions as they come down the side. If I get distracted and I'm not concentrating on that, then Cass will let me know and I can pause that, pause what I'm saying and answer some questions, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So I was going to start with a bit more of a detailed story about how I've ended up in this space. I do all this work in interdisciplinary research, and I always find it interesting. And I think it's important to understand where someone's coming from when they're talking about what they're talking about. So I started off as an environmental scientist. That was what my first degree was in. And I got interested in how people were making decisions and understanding complex environmental systems. And I liked simulation models, and I liked different types of simulation models, and I thought people should be able to learn about environmental systems really well from them. So that's what I wanted to do a PhD on. The Enviro Ed people weren't very interested in that, and they said that I should look for an education PhD instead. And just in the time when all the emails were going backwards and forwards, COCO Research Centre, which is now CRLI at the University of Sydney, had started, it had begun. So Peter Goodyear and Peter Ryman had been brought in to start up this new centre, and I ended up doing my PhD with Peter Ryman and looking at system dynamics models and agent-based models and how school students learnt about different elements of these environmental systems from both. So back then, you couldn't collect log files and click data from those sorts of models. But that's what I was really interested in. I was used to dealing with environmental science research where the idea is to understand what all this activity is, what actually happens. And what I wasn't super interested in education was doing a pre-test and a post-test and ignoring all the stuff that happened in between. So what I ended up doing was taking video screenshots of the students' clicks on the screens and manually coding it to try and find patterns of what they were doing. So after my PhD finished, I did a postdoc for a year with Coco, and I did some of that foundational work with Peter Ryman that led to his 2009 paper about time and events and order and all that sort of stuff. And we did some of that first process mining work with a guy from the Netherlands. And so that was an exercise in taking chat data and again, hard coding it, but really trying to figure out how to play with this big data, because we had chats from many months and we had wikis and we had all of this complicated data. And the idea was that we had to figure out not just coding it, but actually how to break it up so that we could make sense of it in its entirety. After that work, I worked for Michael Jacobson on some of his grants, looking at simulation models and looking at virtual worlds. And at that point, what I got interested in was trying to sync some of this data. So by then we were using Camtasia, but trying to figure out how to align what was going on with their interaction with the tool with what they were saying to each other became the next challenge. And then after that, I worked for Peter Goodyear on his ARC Laureate Fellowship, and then I went from trying to align the data that was just, a pair of students looking at a laptop interacting with a model to groups of people up to 20 people in our design studio at the University of Sydney. And by then we were collecting video and audio and images every 10 seconds of every writable surface that there was and all the design artifacts. And my job there was to take all of that data and kind of separate it out and figure out what we would do with it and then put it back together again so that we could tell a story. So all the time that I've been working in this space that ended up becoming learning analytics, I've been working with the people who end up making it automated and doing the clever stuff that data scientists and computer scientists do, but really working very closely with them so that we can get to the heart of the problem that we're really looking at in research. So I got involved formally in interdisciplinary approaches to research about 6 or 7 years ago. So in ecology, there is this an approach to research called synthesis research, and they don't fund new data collection, they fund bringing people together to work on complex problems. So think climate change, think river systems. There's lots of data out there. What they need is for people to come together and actually work together and share their data and build a model so that they can understand what's going on. So they started up this new synthesis center in Maryland in the States that was socio-environmental synthesis. So they decided to bring social science data in there as well. They kind of got a handle on all this proper modeling, proper science data where you could count stuff, and they decided that the social sciences were important in understanding environmental systems, and they wanted to know how to teach people how to do this. So they brought 40 social science people from all around the world together for a week, and about day 3, there were presentations from everyone, different approaches to understanding environmental systems. And about day 3, the guy in the photo on the top right of the screen, Dave. He's in charge of all the education at SIG, all the education programs and research. And he is a bee scientist by training, and he's a lovely man. And about day 3, he said to us, so what we really need to know is, what does social science data look like? And we all laughed. There were environmental policy people in there, environmental lawyers, and we said, well, you know what, about 40 different types of data, because you've got 40 different people in the room. And what's been fascinating to watch with these guys over the last 6 or 7 years is having them try and fit together these different approaches to collecting data in order to really inform some of the understanding of environmental systems. And they're doing amazing work. Alongside that, I ended up in a group where we were developing an approach to teaching people how to do this sort of interdisciplinary research, which I'll go through in the coming slides. So when they're talking about interdisciplinary research, they're talking about social scientists and natural scientists and, say, engineers, all having to collaborate on a research project. And the problem is, like we know in interdisciplinary research, there are different cultures in those broad areas. Even within those areas, there are different cultures. But if you just try and imagine those 3 areas, they have different ways of working, they have different methods, different types of data, different values, motivations, epistemologies, and they have different tolerance for uncertainty. And that tolerance for uncertainty I find interesting because, say, in social science, I personally, as a social scientist, am okay with a certain amount of uncertainty. I pretty much expect it. Engineers, not so much. So when I'm dealing with that side of my research, it, as far as I'm concerned, overlaps quite a lot with where I see us in learning sciences and learning analytics, because I think you could very roughly imagine a situation where you are working with an instructor and a learning scientist and someone who is a specialist in learning analytics, and come up with those same differences in ways of working, methods of identifying data, differences in data types, in ways you consider evidence, what you want to do with that, different values, different motivations, definitely different epistemologies, and different tolerance for uncertainty. And so as I work with the guys over in the States on those approaches, I'm trying to apply it to how I'm working with people and what we're writing about in how to work with in these teams within education. So I think sometimes in education, we think we get smooshed in all together. And actually, there are some really distinct ways of knowing and ways of understanding that we need to take some time to get our heads around. And I'll just go back to that for a sec, because if we're going to do research with this, or have our teaching informed by it, if you think about a multidisciplinary team, I have certainly been in situations myself where, as a learning scientist, I might have an idea and I will call on someone who I work with to do some of the data science stuff, to do that learning analytics part, and I might find an instructor where I want to implement it. But it's really just being driven by me, and those guys are helping me out, and then we all go back to our lives afterwards. We write a paper or something, that's fine. What we're talking about in interdisciplinary research is where they overlap, where the 3 of us together will sit down and collaborate to come up with the research problem, as well as the research and the solution, the entire, from start to finish. That's where we're going to get to really answering some of the tricky questions. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Learning scientist. So I did a PhD in the learning sciences. This is the science of how people learn. There is a community around it, an international society, and certainly the new stuff on the science of learning incorporates some of that. The new, like the UQ and all those guys doing the science of learning are probably broader than where I usually sit as a learning scientist, so they include all the neuroscience and all those other elements. For me, I am sort of situated in that learning sciences community with the society that's been going for about 50 years or so. Does that answer the question, or too vague? Could also, in this context, could also be educational researcher, could be any of that. In this particular context, I would see that person as kind of bringing some of the theory there. So then you need to think about how that team's going to work. And you need to think about what processes, methods, or tools are going to facilitate the development of that team. Because we've all been in situations where that collaboration doesn't work. And really understanding how it does work. And this is different to collaborative learning. This is more science of team science, which is its whole other field. This is a way of understanding how people can work together in order to solve scientific problems. So so there was a group of us that came out of that original SIG workshop that developed an approach to learning how to be an interdisciplinary researcher, and it comes out of model-based reasoning. And these are 5 indicators that people are engaged, a team is engaged in productive interdisciplinary research. So firstly, identifying an appropriate question. Secondly, developing the shared vocabulary. And that is really important because that is different every single team you're in. So, and particularly if you're all educators and you're all in this field and you're being lumped in together, there are a whole lot of assumptions that we all know we'll have a common understanding of particular terms that we use, even if we're within the same institution that happens. And the best example of that was with this particular group where we were collaborating to come up with this approach, and we were using model-based reasoning, and we'd been meeting for, I don't know, 18 months, 2 or 3 times a year for 18 months, and we got to a point and we kept butting heads over a few things, and someone finally said, "What do you mean when you say model?" And we realized that we were all operating off a slightly different definition of what a model was. Some of us meant an actual, like a system dynamics model, and some of us meant sort of a theoretical model, and all the other definitions that there could be. And so really working together for long enough to develop that shared vocabulary and shared understanding is really important in these teams. The co-creation of boundary negotiating objects is important. Having some physical representation of what it is you're trying to achieve. Again, really difficult in learning design, in learning sciences. We don't have a shared way necessarily of collaborating around that. And that tends to evolve and be different depending on which group we're in. And that was some of the work that we did with Peter Goodyear's ARC Laureate project. So then the use of tools for visualizing and combining data, which I'll talk about in a sec, because that also is something that we have tended to make up as we go. Everyone uses something slightly different in their own approach to it, and it's becoming our ability to standardize that is getting better, and so there are common tools now for doing that, but there weren't when this stuff started. And then a new, more connected understanding of the question. So I guess one of the things to keep in mind with this is that it takes a long time. And most of us, when we're working on research projects, or if we're working in educational contexts for developing learning analytics to inform teaching and practice, it has a really tight timeline. And actually, to do this well, you need to be working with people over a long period of time. So there's been lots of research on this. Some of the other challenges that have been identified are when you've got teams that are highly diverse. So for me, with that particular team, the rest of the people in the team with the States, they're mostly, top professors in environmental science. And then there's me as the learning scientist or educational researcher or learning analytics person, or I end up wearing a whole lot of hats in those meetings. It's hard to bring that to narrow in on a research question that acknowledges all of the different perspectives when you've got a highly diverse team. To get to the point of deep knowledge integration is also challenging if you don't have time to get there. When the team is large, and I'll tell you about one project that we did with probably 11 or 12 people in the team by the end, and that happens in different ways in institutional contexts too. So in reality, the team might look like it's 10 people, but there may be 2 people who are doing most of the work. So managing those different sizes of teams is tricky. When there's goal misalignment, when there are permeable boundaries. So for myself, and the more you work in interdisciplinary teams, the more you expand what you can kind of count yourself as a specialist in. So in some teams, I am the learning analytics person. When I work with the actual educational data miners, I am the learning sciences person. So sometimes I'm getting better at being able to put those boundaries about my role around myself, about my role in different teams. But that takes some practice, and that can end up bring up challenges for working in teams. Geographic dispersion is challenging, and task interdependence when really you need a whole lot of time to do it, but because it's feeding into other things as well. So in my experience with some of this interdisciplinary research that I will tell you about soon, when we're trying to bring together learning analytics and other data and really looking at those multimodal data for learning. So the geographic spread is a killer. When you're doing it for research and you're sitting in Australia, mostly you're collaborating with people internationally, in my experience, and even in different time zones for some of you guys, like Cass in Adelaide. Just getting people together for a meeting is tricky. There's lack of centralised funding for bringing team members together. So when I'm working with people in other countries, we're all kind of self-funding because nobody's funding will cover things that are happening in other countries. And different experience working together. You guys will have experienced this too. When you're working in a team and 2 of you have worked together for a really long time, so you can start to anticipate what they would say in response to something and already adjust your suggestion, versus when you're working with someone for the first time and it takes quite a while to figure out how you're supposed to navigate that space. Epistemology, identifying, aligning, and differentiating underlying beliefs. This is tricky again in these education teams when we all assume that we're coming from the same space, and being able to identify what our underlying beliefs are about learning so that we can both align them and make sure that they're separate and account for these individual perspectives is important. And then identifying appropriate tools for all the different things we need to do with learning analytics. So communicating, this is kind of fine now, sharing data, visualizing analyses, creating and sharing models, depending on what our question is, could be quite different tools. And sometimes we need to create those tools ourselves, which is a whole other set of skills. So this is some of the different data types that I have been working with and have been facing challenges with trying to align. So down the bottom, you've got 2 school students who are writing on a whiteboard. So in reality, most classrooms, whether you're at school or at university, are a combination of physical and digital learning environments. And we are getting better at being able to use learning analytic techniques to be able to get at the activity of learners in physical spaces. So once we do that, so there's that bit of work going on, but we need to then connect it with what's going on in the digital spaces. So down the bottom, you've got kids scribbling on a white wall. you've got, next to that, you've got an image, which is something we've been working on with colleagues at University of Wollongong, Sarah Howard and the guys there who do educational data mining, where they have built an algorithm that they can pass through video and track motion. So this is not particularly complicated computer science as far as my understanding goes. It's then what we do with that that becomes the next thinking point. But that basically gives you a different colored line for whatever segment of video that you run it through. So I'll talk more about that and some of the questions we have that in a sec about that. So then we've also got the discourse. We've got what people are saying to each other. And usually that needs to be transcribed for us to do anything with, unless they're in a chat and they're writing, and that's great, or if they're in a wiki, or if they're doing a written assignment. But then it needs to be coded, and then it needs to be visualized, and it needs to do that for different purposes depending on who the end user is. And that's where the actionable knowledge part comes in. So the actionable knowledge, the idea of it came out of these guys doing synthesis research like 10 or 15 years ago. They've been writing about it since then. And that's the purpose of their research, that the knowledge that's generated from it is something that a policymaker could use to make a decision with, take some action with. So we've adopted it in learning analytics and learning sciences, which is fantastic. But I think in this space, we've got a bunch of end users of this knowledge. We can think about the end users as the researchers, but also as the instructors. And then bigger scale, if you're talking about different types of data, if you're talking about data on maths, like say NAPLAN results, then you're talking about policymakers as well. So it's not as straightforward in this space what actionable knowledge actually is. Mostly though, when I'm thinking about aligning this data, we've got multimodal data. So the little, most of these I'm going to talk about later, but the little social network, what looks like a little social network thing in the middle, that's actually around text and around words. And so generating something like that is fantastic for researchers, but for an instructor to get their head around the representation and the meaning of it in order to make a decision in real time is a lot of steps for that instructor to have to go through. It's a lot of training that's involved. So we need to think about what they actually need to know out of that, and for that we need to work in these interdisciplinary teams. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a big project, lots of people involved. We decided we wanted to give this interdisciplinary research a try. We specifically collected data that we knew lots of different people could extract what they needed from it. And we collaborated with people all over the world. So this is who they were. This is where they were from. So, and everyone has moved around because this thing's been going on for such a long time, but people from Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Spain, France, the US, and University of Sydney. So we were never able to get everyone together for a Skype conference because it would have meant someone being up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and none of us were really that dedicated to the research. Unless a chunk of us were at a conference together and then we could Skype in the rest. But that geographical dispersion of trying to work together in this team was a real challenge in this project. Looking at this team, we had the different colours as sort of different career stages. So we had a nice mix, and that's important in these teams too, to think about at what stage in a career the different people in your team are at. So the blue ones, those for blue, are kind of the early career, mid-career researchers. The red were professors, and the green are or were PhD students. So a few of them got PhDs out of this project. And so what it meant was that when we did have conversations, there were some of us who were kind of driving it, and we had good input from the professors, but they were unlikely to do the actual analysis themselves. But we had PhD students in there who had good motivation to get some of the analysis done. So really did bring it together. And so in this, Greg, Dyke, who's in there, who was sitting in France at the time. He was our person who did the visualizations and the automated type stuff that was in there, although I did, and Peter Ryman did a little bit as well, and Roberto, of course, did some as well. So there were different people who had multiple roles depending on how you looked at it within the project. So this project we ran in the design studio at the University of Sydney. We collected video, audio data, and the artifacts that they created. We gave them a particular task, which was a design task that they needed to do. We gave them a particular scaffold to help them out. Mostly what we're talking about is a scaffold that helped them through a design process. They were graduate students, there were 3 of them, and they had like an hour and a half to do it, and they needed to come up with a design brief by the end. Just getting to that stage of what it was we were going to do, between probably at the time there were 8 of us working on it, getting to what is the core of our research question and how we're going to get at that, bringing our own approach and our own assumptions about learning and methodological approaches, that took a significant amount of time. So what we had though was multimodal interaction analysis needed audio, video, and artifact data. And discursive psychology that Michael Evans did over in the States with Li Xiao needed audio and video data. The stuff that Roberto and Yanis were doing on distributed orchestration just really needed the video. And the conversation analysis, conversational terms, and process mining around design, phases of design and decision making that the rest of us were doing just really needed the audio data with the transcripts. So you can see how we start to get this, we capture kind of everything, and then we have to divide it up, but we have to divide it up differently depending on who the researcher is and who they're working with and the sort of data they need to answer the particular question that they have. And then we bring the theoretical approach as well. So the conversation analysis was used to look at the role of positioning. Knowledge sharing and knowledge integration practices were informed by the conversational turns. We used process to get at phases of design and the decision making that was going on. And then we were looking at the use of tools, and we were looking at gesture and engagement in the discursive psychology part, and then the physical location of participants as well as the discourse and the gestures for the multimodal interaction analysis. So hugely complex, complex data set, complex configuration of people and expertise and data, and automated versus hand-coded, or en masse versus just a tiny segment of it because we're going to look at it in depth. Project. So this is some of the different representations that we ended up. So positioning in this context was about how you position yourself. So not my area, but best explanation, my best understanding is it's about how you position yourself in a particular conversation as, in this case, as an expert in a particular thing. So one student in the group really positioned themselves from the start as, I know a lot about design, so I'm going to take the lead in this. And others, you can look at the language in order to figure out how they're positioning themselves in terms of different roles within and different epistemological assumptions in how they're collaborating. That's Mariam's work, and she's used that in her PhD as well. It's really interesting. So these are some of the different representations. One of them is, again, writing on a white wall. So we've got pictures that were taken of the white walls. That means you need the photos to be of a decent quality to be able to get to them, which this one is not for this particular presentation. You need to think about stuff like, don't click in the green pen to write on the wall. We also had Markov transition diagrams used in process analysis. We've got down there conversational turns that were visualized in Tatiana. So Tatiana was what the software that we used that Greg developed to align all the data. And so that meant that all of that, we had people do this analysis like the positioning, and so what you do is kind of read through a ill-defined amount of the transcription to be able to identify that at this point they're positioning themselves in this way, but that needs to translate through to something that can be aligned and put into Greg's system so that it can match up with other things that are happening at the time, align with other things that are happening. And that needs to be in a certain format to be imported into Tatiana. And then what we ended up doing with it was coming together. So we've got all of our individual analyses of what's going on. We've got Greg aligning them over using time, really. But also what we need to do is figure out what's kind of connected. So what we did was make these system maps of, and we used the ACAB framework that Peter Goodyear and Lucilla came up with that was about, well, what can we actually think about what we can design for? So if we're thinking about who the end users are of this, it would be someone who needs to design a task. So if they can design the social interactions or the roles, and if they can design what tools to use and they can design what tasks are given to them, then let's collect data around that and let's see how those three things are linked together in the actual activity of the learners. And so what we were creating was very complicated systems maps that meant that we could start to make sense of the results of all those analyses, the findings of all of them, how they could be put together to inform a designer. So the thing with this research, and what we've done with this research over the years is things like share the data. So it's open data. It was in the BJET special issue that was all on shared data. We've done symposia and things about it. Any of these interdisciplinary projects where you're actually getting people to collaborate together around something, it takes a really long time, and to find the right venue for publishing on it is also tricky. So we all want journal articles, obviously, and you play this game of somewhere between it's far too complicated to talk about all of it, but if you just talk about one bit, it's not that interesting on its own. The interesting thing is how it all is all coming together. So it's taking a while to find the right home for the work that we've been doing for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now. But in the process of that, lots of those questions that we're all dealing with in learning analytics have come about. How do we represent the data? Who is it for in the end? How do we work together? So the more recent stuff I've been doing is in classroom analytics. And I guess what we're calling classroom analytics. That's mainly with Sarah Howard down at the University of Wollongong. Also involves Nick Kelly, who's at QUT now, who I first worked with down at Sydney Uni, Harry Canassi here at Griffith, Julian Jack, they're our educational data miners. Abelardo is involved as well. And then the original stuff that we did also involved David Ash and Lucilla and Peter Goodyear and Martin Grizio when we were all at Sydney University together. So what we've been doing with that is developing these algorithms that track people. And we've got a paper under review at the moment, because the thing is that that's great. That's super cool that we can do that. I just stood up at a poster at CSCL a month or so ago and was talking about it. There's lots of interest in being able to do this, but what a teacher can do with that, what a researcher can even do with that, that's what we need to get to. That's that generation of actionable knowledge. And actually what we need to do with it, I think, is use it to extract other things, to classify what they're, as a researcher, what we need to do first is use that to classify what it is that they're doing, some measure of being stationary or pacing or exploring, and then we need to translate it into how that changes over time so that we can give teachers the tools that they need to be able to manage a classroom situation. So this is another thing. This is Nick's stuff where he's natural language processing, and we can run transcripts through his algorithm, and it basically will identify what the topics are, what the important words are in there, nouns. So again, being able to show teachers how something's changed. So just flashing these things up is not going to be particularly useful because it's hard to keep all of that in mind from how a conversation has changed and shifted over time for a teacher. Also knowing what that means. So understanding the assessment, again, coding this in some way and then showing how it unfolds over time. So that's what we've been suggesting, that there are more steps needed and that the end user is not always the researcher or the learning analytics person, it's someone who has to use it in the classroom environment. But we need all three of those people to come together to figure out how to do all of it, not just one thing. My next steps in this space is the Creative Practice Lab. And so what we're doing here, so we've got almost $300 in funding here to keep this new learning space out for research. The classroom analytics, both. So we have applied it to higher education settings. That was the image that we just saw back here. This one's on postgrad students, master's students doing this stuff, which is old data we collected back at Sydney, but we're also using it in school classrooms because school classrooms are just chaos in real life, and most of the research looks at it as if it's a very contained, especially around collaboration, and actually kids are going everywhere all the time. What we're doing with the Creative Practice Lab is we've got this new learning space, and what my grant got us was cameras, audio recorders, all those things we need to collect the data. I've got some people to work on developing some of that stuff that I've been working on for years to be able to do it in an automated way. So to be able to take transcript and automatically code it for some of those things so that a teacher could put into a system, okay, I'm really interested if they're talking about these topics, and I'm really interested if they are on task. And I think that the way I would say that they're on task is if they're using these particular words. And we're going to be able to line that up with where they're moving and where they are. And it's, you know, future learning space, movable furniture, open it up, could have 100 people in here at the same time. We've also got a makerspace in there, so getting into some of that, the robotics and making and those inquiry approaches to learning. We've got the real classrooms. So we've got mobile versions of those data collection kits, which Sarah and I have been working on, that can just go into a classroom, it writes the video to the cloud, you can leave it there for 50 days, and the teacher has control over what's recorded and what's not recorded. And we get all of that video data. And then we've got an online space to bring all these people together, because the theme is kind of around STEAM education. So bring these teachers and university people together, academics together, to be able to create this network around it. But we're also going to be developing a virtual internship with David Schaffer over in the States around evidence-based practice. So how teachers are using data in order to inform their practice, in order to collect evidence of impact of learning, because that's now required with the ASCILITE standards, and we need to be able to teach our teachers how to do it. So kind of in this space now where we are going to spend the next year or two really building and connecting all this stuff that I've been working on for the past 10 years in a way to fit it all together, which is quite a nice space to be in. And that's pretty much what I was going to be talking about today. So that is a bunch of papers where we've published on the stuff that I've been talking about. And I wanted to say thank you very much and open up to any other questions that anyone has.
Thanks, Kate. We've had a few questions through the presentation that Kate addressed, but I'm just wondering if people do have questions. You could even, maybe we can use the hand raising or just put things in the comment field there on the side. So any questions from people? No. Kate, you'll see that I've taken the slides back to the one that you were speaking with at the end here. And I'm just really interested. This is clearly a school-based project. And I was just an observation throughout here, you know, the notion of being with some of your analysis here, being guided by what the teacher's looking for as evidence of engagement. Would you also frame your research to see if there were other indicators beyond what teachers might be looking for to inform them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will clarify the only official nice photos that we have so far was a bunch of kids in their gear. So it looks very school focused. Because I sit in the School of Education, our students that we're teaching are pre-service teachers. So it ends up all being very confused. But the idea is that we do tertiary-based stuff in here as well as be able to get school groups in as well. So it goes that broad. But absolutely, I think a lot of the motivation for my research in this space is because we're changing the learning environments, and we've been doing that quite a lot. These new open plan learning spaces, we are expecting big classes, team teaching, changes to the way we're thinking about our pedagogy, or online, or all these other digital elements in there. And that's not necessarily the indicators of whether students are collaborating, whether they're engaging, are actually different if we're thinking about ways of them learning and engaging in learning. So yes, there needs to be the theory that informs that. We need to do research around that and actually find out what's going on. But having said that, experienced teachers do this stuff without thinking about it. So if you watch them in a classroom, they know how to do this. So getting them involved and getting them to unpack it and figure out what's going on and what they're actually reacting to, so that we can use this for pre-service teacher education, so that they're not spending all the time just figuring out what's going on, I think is really important. Particularly some of this inquiry stuff, it's chaos. It looks like absolute chaos. And being able to use some of that stuff like motion tracking, or showing the patterns of discourse. When we look at that stuff as a teacher, as an instructor, what feels like off-task behaviour, like sword fighting with rulers with some of these little kids, it feels like it goes for forever. And when you look at it on a video, it's maybe 40 seconds. So using all of that information to help our pre-service teachers be prepared, or our practicing teachers being prepared to work in new spaces, I think it's going to be really useful. The question here too about ethical issues, recording video and audio for research subjects. We of course get ethics approval to do it. In Sydney, University of Sydney, we established the rules were, if you came into the design studio at the University of Sydney, you're engaging in a research project. And we could have school groups come in there, but having said so, some of the stuff we did at the University of Sydney, if you were using the room, it was a research space. You had to agree to participate in the research, otherwise you could find a space to do the stuff you were doing somewhere else. Having said that, we would sometimes have school groups in there, and the rules were you can still participate in whatever it is that we're running in that space. We'll record everything, but we just won't use the groups that have the people in there that don't want to be part of it. The stuff that happens in classrooms, that's the same. If there are students who don't want to be filmed, then the cameras that we're using in the classroom environment is totally portable. The teacher can just make sure that those students are out of camera shot. They can always see what's going on their device. And what's happening in here will be similar rules to the University of Sydney. So classes will go on. If there are students who don't want to participate in the research, that's fine, they're allowed to. We just won't use the data that we collect from them. And if that becomes an issue, then of course their rights to control their own data take precedence over our research projects. So it's kind of fiddly, but then once, because we've because I spent a long time at Sydney figuring this out. We've kind of got a model that seems to work, and one of the tricky bits about doing this with these international interdisciplinary teams is when you add extra people later. And sometimes university ethics committees will just let you add that person into the system without having to notify people who and these guys are analysing the data. And for that project, that big project I was talking about, that was a huge issue because the people participating in it, who were the subjects, were graduate students in our lab. So I could imagine a situation where they would be at a conference watching some professor that we'd added onto the team later give a presentation, and it turns out that the analysis was about them. Or they could be sitting next to someone doing their PhD on it and look over and realise the video was of themselves. So we set up extra systems so that the people who are participating in those projects have the option to keep being contacted if we add extra people into the team, and they can say yes or no if they want that extra person having access to that data. Mostly people just said yes, because for them it was, you know, an hour and a half of their lives 2 years ago, and they don't even remember it. But for us, we're kind of in the middle of it, and it feels a lot more personal. But I always like to give people choice. Will engagement data be triangulated with learning outcomes? Yes, it will be. But I think what one of the interesting things about the research that we're doing at the moment is figuring out what the learning outcomes are that we're actually looking for. So does more chaos equal more learning? Kind of depends on the chaos and kind of depends on the patterns that you can see in that chaos. But yes, the idea is that we figure out what the learning outcomes are and what the patterns are that lead to different learning outcomes. So that other group, not the big study, but the group that I was showing you some of the motion tracking and stuff for, those guys were working, they were graduate students working on a project as part of one of their courses in their masters. And so we knew what the assessment marks were, and we knew there were different ways that they were assessed in the final thing. So we could sort of look at, well, they were pretty much on par with the rest of the class in particular areas, but the way that they pulled together all of their different ideas was actually better than anyone else in the class. So we were looking for what are the patterns in that group that might explain why they did so much better.
I'll just wait a couple minutes. Yes? No, that's a comment. Okay. There we go, Kate.
How generalizable? Yeah, look, I think we're at early stages to be thinking about generalizable, but what I like about using the ACAD framework is that we can start to get a longer picture. So I tend to do design-based research, and what that means is that we can start to map out the design in a way that we can compare the context between learning situations. So we're not going to be able to look at, I think one problem in educational research is we get these results from a classroom study that look great, but it's very hard to tease out what the context was, what the design was, to be able to figure out whether that would work in another person's context. And that person doesn't tease their context out to say why it did or didn't work. So I like using the ACAD framework because that makes us do that mapping, and because we use it in combination with Bill Sandoval's conjecture mapping. So it helps us ask questions that are about the design, and it also helps us ask questions that are about the theory. And so I tend to think about the design conjectures being about what is it about this design that I think will inform particular learner activity, and the theoretical conjectures are about what is it about this this particular learner activity that I think is the reason that we have these learning outcomes. And so if we get enough studies that start to map it like that, and we can actually figure out what the similarities and differences are in different contexts, then we can get to the generalizable stage. But absolutely finding surprises all the time. There's one study where we all thought all the students were off task the whole time. Turns out they were just having fun doing the thing that we asked them to do. So yeah, nice surprises usually.
Thanks, Kate. That's been a really wonderful presentation. I'm just going to close, but before doing so, I thought I'd quickly remind people of ALASI, which is the Australian Learning Analytics Summer Institute. It's a 2-day event, and it's occurring the 30th of November to the 1st of December at University of Queensland. For people who are unfamiliar with ALASI, it's actually it's not so much a heavy conference per se, but it's where you actually find out who's doing what in the space right now. So there's a bit of a focus on what's emerging in terms of tools and things. And if you look in the website, just search for ALASI 2017, you can find a little bit more information, and the deadlines for submissions close on the 1st of September, so there's still time to get a submission in if you've got a story that you'd like to share. So a lot of people are now thanking Kate for her wonderful presentation, and I'm going to finish the recording now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.